This transition reveals something important about human culture. Rituals evolve when they become too costly. What began as a literal act of loyalty slowly transformed into symbolic representation. The pharaohs remained powerful in their tombs, but no longer at the cost of hundreds of lives. It is worth noting that Egypt was not alone in this practice. Retainer sacrifice has appeared in many ancient cultures. In Mesopotamia, at the royal cemetery of Yopsi, archaeologists found retainers buried with kings and queens, sometimes with golden lyres and chariots. In early China, the tombs of rulers also held sacrificed servants. Even in some African kingdoms, rulers were sometimes accompanied by retainers in death. It seems that in humanity's earliest civilizations, the idea of surrounding rulers with attendants in the afterlife was widespread, but Egypt's case is particularly well documented. The dry desert preserved bodies, beads, and tools, leaving us with a chillingly clear picture of how early Egyptians imagined eternity. As you picture these graves, think not of the famous golden mask of Tutankhamun or the vast pyramids of Giza, but of modest pits dug in rows, filled with ordinary people whose names are lost, but whose fate still whispers through the sand. The practice leaves us with questions about what loyalty means. Were these attendants loyal by choice or by force? Did they see death as a passage, or simply as an order they could not refuse? We cannot ask them, but their silence is loud. As the desert winds bury and uncover fragments of pottery, one fact remains: the pharaoh was never alone. Even in death, he was surrounded. Yet the price of that companionship was life itself. And here, as you listen in the quiet, another question drifts into your mind. When the Egyptians abandoned retainer sacrifice and turned to figurines instead, did they truly evolve in compassion, or did they simply discover a more efficient way to symbolize human devotion? The desert is still. You imagine yourself walking deeper into the necropolis of Abydos, the shifting sand crunching beneath your feet, the sun low against the horizon. You pause at the rectangular remains of Jer's tomb, then glance outward at the smaller mounds scattered in careful rows. It feels less like a resting place and more like a silent army frozen in time. Each grave a soldier in the pharaoh's eternal court. By now, the practice of retainer sacrifice has been abandoned for thousands of years. The sands covered these graves long before Egypt's great pyramids rose. Yet, when archaeologists uncovered them, the world was startled. This was not the Egypt of painted walls, golden coffins, or grand temples. This was Egypt at its rawest, a place where death was not merely represented, but enacted. Let us consider the legacy of Jer's burial. On the surface, it might seem a cruel curiosity from a long-forgotten age, but its echoes run deeper. Abydos became one of the most sacred places in Egyptian religion. Later pharaohs, long after retainer sacrifice ceased, still built shrines and cenotaphs here, connecting themselves to the earliest rulers. The site became a center of worship for the god Osiris, lord of the afterlife. The choice of Abydos as Osiris's sacred ground may not be accidental. Perhaps the collective memory of mass burials, lives bound to the king, helped cement the idea of Abydos as a place where the living and the dead intersected. For archaeologists, the discovery of Jer's tomb and its retainer burials in the late 19th century forced a reconsideration of Egyptian history. Egypt had long been imagined as a civilization of wisdom and majesty, with golden masks and sophisticated temples. But these graves revealed a harsher truth. In its earliest days, Egyptian kingship was enforced not only by monuments, but by human lives sacrificed to to reinforce divine authority. This realization made Egypt feel both more human and more unsettling. It also raises practical questions. How were these sacrifices carried out? The graves provide clues. The bodies show no signs of violent trauma, suggesting that attendants were not killed by weapons. Instead, they may have been strangled, suffocated, or given poison. This points to a ritualized process, controlled, calm, perhaps even framed as a sacred transition. Imagine the scene: priests moving among the chosen attendants, speaking words of comfort or command, preparing them for what they called eternity. One by one, they entered their small chambers, lay upon mats, and allowed death to take them. The king's death became not only a moment of mourning, but a vast and orchestrated passage for many. Some scholars wonder if the attendants believed this was truly an honor. Egyptian religion already stressed the importance of the afterlife, but usually for those who could afford proper burials. For a servant to be buried near the pharaoh might have seemed a gift, a shortcut to eternity. Yet the choice may not have been theirs. Power and faith are rarely easy to separate. The practice stopped abruptly. By the time of the Second Dynasty, pharaohs were no longer accompanied by sacrificed retainers. Instead, they turned to symbolism, clay or wooden figurines that could serve in the afterlife. This shift reflects a wider truth about human societies. Customs evolve when they become too costly. The sacrifice of so many retainers could drain the living kingdom of its best-trained servants and soldiers. Moreover, as Egyptian religious ideas matured, images and words themselves gained power. An inscribed name could preserve a soul. A carved figurine could do work in the afterlife. The ritual no longer required real blood, and so, as centuries passed, the memory of retainer sacrifice faded. Egyptians of later dynasties probably looked back on it as a distant, almost mythic practice. By the time of the pyramids, no one was killed to accompany the king. Instead, laborers built stone monuments that themselves became eternal servants. Yet here is the paradox. While the later pyramids remain world-famous, the quieter tomb of Djur holds a truth about the foundations of Egyptian kingship that the pyramids never reveal. Before stone, before grand temples, before Ushabtis, there was human sacrifice. When archaeologists kneel in the sand at Abydos, brushing dust away from beads or a rusted blade, they are not uncovering treasures but lives. Lives cut short not because of personal choice, but because of a system that demanded devotion even in death. These were not nameless shadows to their families. Each was a son, a daughter, perhaps a sibling or a friend. And yet all that survives of them is a pit in the desert sand. The calm voice of history reminds you that rituals, no matter how brutal, were once seen as necessary. To those who lived in Jeris, Egypt, retainer sacrifice was not cruelty, it was order. The king was the bridge between humans and the divine, and his passing required balance. The living followed him, just as shadows follow the body. And so you stand, in imagination, at the edge of this ancient tomb. The desert stretches silent and endless around you, the horizon shimmering with heat. You wonder how many footsteps once echoed here, of mourners, priests, grieving families. How many voices were hushed as sand was poured over the attendants' final resting places. And how, millennia later, the silence remains unbroken, save for the wind that drifts across the dunes. You ask yourself, what do these burials say about the nature of power? Was the pharaoh's authority so immense that it demanded hundreds of lives at his passing? Or does it tell us something broader, that in every age, people have given their lives, willingly or unwillingly, to uphold systems larger than themselves? The answer lies buried with them. Story 2. The emperor who rested with clay soldiers. Imagine standing in a vast underground chamber, silent but for the faint echo of your footsteps. The air is cool, the soil damp, and in the half-light, rows upon rows of figures rise out of the earth. Soldiers, thousands of them, each carved in clay, each standing at attention as though awaiting a command that has not come in more than 2,000 years. This is the burial army of Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of China, a man whose quest for immortality has become legend, and whose burial remains one of the most ambitious funerary projects in human history. Qin Shi Huang, 259 to 210 BCE, is remembered as the ruler who unified China, bringing together warring states under a single empire. He built roads, standardized weights and measures, and began the construction of the Great Wall. His reign was short but transformative. Yet in life, he was consumed by a single obsession: death. More precisely, how to overcome it. He sent expeditions in search of the elixir of life, drank concoctions of mercury in hopes of prolonging his years, and commissioned vast works to ensure his power endured. When he died at the age of 49, his burial reflected not only his accomplishments but his fears. Where Pharaoh Jura surrounded himself with the bodies of real attendants, Qin Shi Huang turned to something else: an army of clay soldiers, each crafted to guard him in the afterlife. Discovered in 1974 by farmers digging a well near Xi'an, the terracotta army is one of the greatest archaeological finds of the modern era. But to understand its meaning, you must step back and picture the emperor's vision. The underground necropolis was not a simple tomb. Ancient records suggest it was a city for the dead, a mirror of the world above. The historian Sima Qian, writing about a century after Qin Shi Huang's death, described it as a complex filled with palaces, towers, and rivers of mercury flowing through channels to imitate real waterways. Over 700,000 laborers are said to have worked on the project for decades. It was, in every sense, an empire beneath the earth. At the heart of this city lay the emperor's sealed burial chamber, which to this day remains unopened. Around it stretched pits filled with terracotta soldiers, horses, and chariots, an army meant not for conquest in the living world, but for defense in eternity. The soldiers, themselves, are extraordinary. Each figure stands roughly 6 feet tall, crafted with individualized features. Some wear armor, others simple robes. Their hair is styled in knots or caps, depending on rank. The level of detail is so precise that you can see moustaches, wrinkles, even fingernails. They were once painted in bright colors, though exposure to air caused the pigments to fade quickly. Imagine how they looked when first completed: a vivid, lifelike army standing in rows, their eyes gleaming, ready to serve their emperor beyond death. But why clay soldiers instead of human sacrifices? Earlier Chinese rulers, like Egypt's pharaohs, had sometimes been buried with retainers. In fact, retainer sacrifice was practiced during the Shang dynasty centuries before Qin. Yet by the time Qin Shi Huang rose to power, the tradition had largely ended. Instead, artisans created symbolic substitutes. The emperor's choice of a terracotta army reflects both practical considerations and symbolic ambition. It spared human lives, but it also allowed for something grander, a force larger than any real army could provide. Archaeologists estimate that over 8,000 soldiers, along with 600 horses and 130 chariots, were buried. No king, no matter how powerful, could command so many real retainers in death. But in clay, he could not think, for a moment, about the workers who built this army. Records speak of artisans laboring for years, their families perhaps tied to the project for generations. The emperor was known for his harshness. Those who spoke against him were executed, sometimes buried alive. It is likely that many of the workers who crafted the army never left the necropolis alive. Tomb workers in ancient China were often sealed within the complex to keep its secrets hidden. The silence of the pits may not only be the silence of clay, but also of those who died creating it. The terracotta army is more than a marvel of scale. It reflects a mindset, the belief that the emperor's power was absolute, even beyond death. Just as Pharaoh took his attendants into eternity, Qin Shi Huang took soldiers, not real bodies, but carefully molded echoes of them. Yet the choice reveals something striking. Human societies evolve from the literal to the symbolic, but the intent remains the same. Power seeks permanence. Consider the layout of the army. The soldiers are arranged in battle formation, facing east, toward the lands the emperor had conquered. Infantry stand at the front, archers on the sides, chariots positioned for mobility. It is not a random scattering of statues, but a deliberate recreation of military order. To walk among them today is to walk through a frozen battlefield, one that never fought, but still radiates discipline and purpose. And then there is the emperor himself. His burial chamber remains hidden beneath a mound, unopened for fear of damage. Ancient texts describe it as decorated with constellations on the ceiling, rivers of mercury flowing to represent seas and oceans, and crossbows rigged to fire at intruders. Modern surveys have detected unusually high levels of mercury in the soil, lending weight to the old accounts. If true, Qin Shi Huang lies at the center of a toxic river, a reflection of his quest for eternal control. What strikes you as you picture this necropolis is the contrast. On the surface, fields of wheat ripple in the breeze. Farmers tend their crops, unaware for centuries of the empire below. Beneath them lies a silent city, its soldiers waiting, its rivers poisoned, its emperor entombed. It is a reminder that history often hides its strangest truths just below the ground we walk on. And so you pause and wonder, was Qin Shi Huang's terracotta army an act of genius, transforming sacrifice into art, or was it simply another expression of fear, a desperate attempt by a mortal man to control what cannot be controlled? Picture yourself standing at the edge of one of the terracotta army's excavation pits. From where you are, the ranks seem endless, lines of warriors stretching into the shadows, each slightly different, each staring ahead with a solemn patience that has lasted more than 2 millennia. To understand how they came to be, you must look back to the years of Qin Shi Huang's reign, when the emperor's fear of death pressed thousands of hands into shaping this silent army. Qin Shi Huang came to power as a young king of the state of Qin during the Warring States period, a time when rival kingdoms fought bitterly for control of China. By 221 BCE, through ruthless campaigns and clever reforms, he unified them all, becoming the first emperor of a new dynasty. This was a monumental achievement, but unification did not bring him peace. Instead, it deepened his anxiety. If death could undo what he had built, what was the point of empire? And so the emperor turned to projects meant to resist death itself. He built palaces, roads, and canals, but none equaled the ambition of his tomb. Historical records say construction began as soon as he became king, decades before his death. The work was vast, requiring hundreds of thousands of laborers, farmers pressed into service, prisoners of war, skilled artisans, and engineers. Generations of hands shaped clay, baked bricks, carved weapons, and dug chambers. The process of making the terracotta soldiers was as meticulous as it was massive. Each figure was built in parts. Legs and feet formed first, then torsos, then arms, then heads. Molds may have been used for efficiency, but artisans individualized details by hand. The curl of a mustache, the set of the eyes, the folds of a robe. This was no assembly line of identical statues. It was a labor of both scale and individuality. Modern scholars compare it to an early kind of mass production, with workshops divided into teams, each responsible for different aspects. Once shaped, the figures were fired in kilns, hardening them into durable clay forms. They were then painted with bright pigments, cinnabar red, malachite green, azurite blue, and given real weapons, bronze swords, spears, and crossbows, sharpened to deadly edges. The army was not only symbolic, it was equipped for war. Standing in neat battle formation, their weapons gleaming, the soldiers must have looked almost alive, ready to march. But behind this artistry was cruelty. Historical accounts tell us that the emperor ruled with an iron hand. His obsession with secrecy was notorious. Those who worked on the tomb were often executed or buried alive to ensure no details escaped. Imagine the artisans shaping lifelike faces, knowing they themselves might never leave the necropolis. Their creations would endure, but they would not. In this way, the terracotta army is both a wonder of human craft and a monument to human suffering. At the center of it all was Qin Shi Huang's obsession with immortality. He sent expeditions across the seas in search of the fabled Isles of the Immortals. Alchemists brewed potions promising eternal life. Ironically, many of these contained mercury, which is toxic. The emperor ingested these elixirs regularly, believing them to preserve him, but instead they likely hastened his decline. When he died during a tour of his empire in 210 BCE, his body was carried back to the capital secretly, hidden in a wagon filled with rotting fish to disguise the smell. His tomb was ready. The army awaited. Think of the symbolism here. The emperor searched for life beyond life, yet prepared so carefully for death that his afterlife was built long before his final breath. It is as though he accepted death's inevitability while still raging against it, a contradiction written in clay and mercury. What makes the terracotta army so haunting is its mixture of permanence and fragility. For centuries, it lay untouched beneath the soil. When the first figures were uncovered in 1974, their paint flaked away almost instantly upon contact with air. The army was meant to last forever, yet time strips it bare. The emperor's sealed chamber remains unopened. Partly for this reason, scientists fear that rushing in could destroy whatever lies within, erasing secrets preserved for 2,000 years. The weapons found with the soldiers also tell a story. Bronze blades, still sharp after centuries, reveal the sophistication of Qin metallurgy. Some were coated with chrome-like finishes that resisted rust. For years, scholars debated whether this was an intentional treatment or a lucky coincidence of soil chemistry. Either way, the effect is striking. Weapons buried underground, yet gleaming as if forged yesterday. The army was not only artistic, it was functional. The layout of the necropolis further emphasizes the emperor's ambition. Excavations show that the pits were arranged to guard the central tomb. Infantry filled the front lines, archers flanked the sides, and cavalry stood ready with horses modeled in clay. Chariots were positioned at intervals, suggesting mobility and command. This was not a random collection of statues, but a carefully organized battlefield, a reflection of military order carried into eternity. The sheer scale of the project boggles the mind. Over 8,000 soldiers, along with 600 horses and more than 100 chariots, have been discovered so far, and archaeologists believe many more remain buried. Add to this musicians, officials, acrobats, and even animals, all represented in clay, and you see that the emperor's afterlife was designed as a complete world, not merely a tomb. And yet, despite all this preparation, one detail is unavoidable. Qin Shi Huang did not escape death. His search for elixirs failed, his empire collapsed shortly after his passing, and his dynasty lasted only 15 years beyond his life. The terracotta army stands as both triumph and irony, a grand statement of power, built for a man who could not conquer mortality. As you stand in your imagination among the clay soldiers, quiet and watchful, another thought arises. Were these figures truly guardians of the emperor? Or have they become something else? Guardians of memory, silently reminding us that even the greatest rulers are powerless against time. You stand now at the edge of the central mound where Qin Shi Huang himself is believed to rest. Unlike the open pits where his clay soldiers have been revealed, the emperor's chamber remains sealed, hidden beneath layers of earth and mystery. For more than 2,000 years, no one has entered it. The silence around the burial chamber is heavy, almost deliberate, as though the tomb itself resists intrusion. The ancient historian Sima Qi, writing a century after the emperor's death, described the tomb in extraordinary detail. According to his account, the underground palace was vast, with ceilings painted to resemble constellations and floors inlaid with rivers of flowing mercury to mimic seas and oceans. Crossbows were said to be rigged to fire at intruders. Rare gems and treasures lined the walls. At the very heart lay Qin Shi Huang in his golden coffin, preserved in a world built to last forever. For centuries, these accounts were thought to be exaggerated, but modern science has forced us to reconsider. Soil tests around the tomb mound have revealed high concentrations of mercury, far above normal levels. This suggests that the stories of rivers of mercury may be true. If so, then beneath the earth lies a chamber filled with toxic, shimmering liquid, a strange river of death created by a man who believed mercury might grant him eternal life. The chamber has never been opened, not because archaeologists lack curiosity, but because technology is not yet ready. To break into the tomb risks destroying whatever lies within. Ancient paints, fabrics, and materials could crumble instantly upon contact with air, just as the pigments on the terracotta soldiers did when they were first unearthed. Scientists wait, hoping that one day technology will allow a safe entry. But for now, the emperor remains undisturbed. What does it mean that such a treasure lies hidden? On the surface, visitors see the soldiers, thousands of silent guardians lined in formation. They are breathtaking enough. But at the center of it all is something even stranger, an unopened secret, a time capsule that might hold knowledge of ancient China's lost technologies, art, and beliefs. It is as though the emperor's greatest defense is not his clay army, but time itself, keeping his secrets sealed. The terracotta army, meanwhile, has become more than just a funerary artifact. It is a symbol of China's deep history, of craftsmanship and ambition. The figures travel in exhibitions around the world, their faces familiar even to those who know little of Chinese history. Each one carries the memory of the artisans who shaped it, the empire that demanded it, and the ruler who sought to live forever. But as you linger in thought, a subtle irony becomes clear. Qin Shi Huang's dynasty collapsed almost immediately after his death. His son proved weak, rebellions broke out, and the Qin dynasty fell within 15 years. The great empire he united dissolved almost as soon as he was gone. The emperor prepared for eternity, but his legacy in life was fragile. His afterlife became more permanent than his rule, and so the question emerges: what truly endures, power or memory? The emperor's soldiers endure because they were buried, hidden from the world for centuries. His empire, by contrast, crumbled because it was too visible, too fragile, too dependent on fear. In death, his vision proved stronger than in life. Consider also the contrast with Egypt's pharaohs. Pharaoh Jer took his attendants into death, their lives cut short to serve him. Qin Shi Huang spared human life, at least in burial, but commanded a workforce so large that countless laborers likely died building his tomb. Both reveal the same truth. Rulers, in their quest for permanence, draw upon the lives of their people. Eternity is built not by gods, but by hands that rarely receive credit. The soldiers themselves whisper of this paradox. Each face is different, sculpted with care. Archaeologists believe the artisans modeled features after real individuals, giving the army a sense of humanity. And yet, these faces were not meant to be admired by future generations. They were meant to be buried, unseen, for eternity. What we marvel at today was, in its time, an act of secrecy. As you imagine walking between the rows of clay warriors, the quiet grows heavy. Thousands of eyes seem to watch you, though they are made of clay. They guard not only their emperor, but also his silence. And you wonder what lies in the sealed chamber at the center of it all. Treasures beyond imagining, rivers of mercury, perhaps even scrolls that could change what we know of early China. Or perhaps nothing more than dust and bones. The final irony of a man who feared death so much that he built an empire underground to hide from it. You step back, the earth closing again in your mind's eye. Above, farmers still tend their fields. Children play in villages nearby. Life continues, unaware of the world beneath. And the emperor remains where he has always been, silent, sealed, guarded by clay. And so you are left with a final thought. Drifting in the quiet of history, was Qin Shi Huang's burial the triumph of human ambition? Or was it the greatest monument to the futility of trying to escape the simple truth that all rulers, no matter how mighty, must one day die? Story 3. The Queen Who Slept in a Ship. You find yourself standing in a quiet Norwegian valley in the early 20th century. The earth here is damp, heavy with the weight of centuries of rain and frost, and the rolling fields seem calm, almost ordinary. But beneath one mound of grass and soil, something extraordinary waited. Preserved for over 1,000 years, the Oseberg ship burial, one of the richest and strangest Viking graves ever discovered. The year was 1904, when farmers digging into a burial mound near the Oseberg farm uncovered wood, not just any wood, but the curved planks of a Viking ship. Archaeologists soon arrived, carefully excavating the mound to reveal a vessel nearly 70 feet long, carved with intricate animal designs along its prow. This was not a warship meant for raids, nor a trading vessel meant for cargo. It was a ship for death, a vessel laid underground to carry its passengers into the afterlife. Inside the ship lay the remains of 2 women. This alone made the find unusual. Viking graves often contained men, warriors, chiefs, explorers, But here, two women had been given the honor of a ship burial, one of the highest forms of funerary display in Norse culture. Their bones told different stories. One was in her 70s, frail with age, her teeth worn down, her spine curved. The other was younger, perhaps in her 40s, still strong in stature. Together, they had been buried with wealth and ceremony. The grave goods astonished archaeologists. Carpets woven with detailed patterns, wooden carts and sledges decorated with carved animal heads, buckets bound with bronze fittings, beds, chests, textiles, and tools. Even skeletal remains of animals, horses, dogs, oxen, were laid alongside them, sacrificed to serve in the afterlife. It was not only a burial, but a statement of status, wealth, and reverence. Whoever these women were, they mattered deeply to those who buried them. Scholars debated their identities. The older woman is often thought to have been a queen or noblewoman, perhaps linked to the royal Yngling dynasty. Some suggested she was Queen Sar, the grandmother of Harald Fairhair, who would later unite Norway. The younger woman may have been a trusted servant, a companion, or even a priestess. Their exact names remain unknown, but their burial speaks loudly enough. Why a ship? In Norse belief, ships were more than vessels of wood and sail. They were symbols of passage, of movement between worlds. To place the dead in a ship was to provide them with transport into the afterlife. Some ships were burned, their flames rising into the sky like a final voyage. Others, like the Oseberg ship, were buried, their hulls carrying the dead into the earth. In both cases, the meaning was clear. The soul was traveling on. The craftsmanship of the Oseberg ship is itself breathtaking. Carved along its sides are intertwining animals, dragons, serpents, beasts of myth. The prow curls upward like a serpent's head, a silent guardian of the women within. The ship was seaworthy, yet it never sailed after being placed in the mound. Instead, it became a coffin, a floating hall set upon soil rather than sea. The textiles found within the grave are among the most valuable artifacts. Fragments of silk, likely imported from distant lands, suggest connections far beyond Scandinavia. Imagine the hands that wove them, the long trade routes that carried them from Byzantium or the Islamic world, the wealth required to obtain them, even in death. These women displayed connections to a broader world, their burial mound in rural Norway, linked to far-off empires, but not everything in the grave was intact. Time had taken its toll. The women's bones were damaged, some missing, and the organic materials had decayed. Yet enough remained to give us a vivid picture. Beds still bore their carvings. Wooden wagons and sledges, with animal headposts, were preserved. Small tools, weaving instruments, buckets, cooking gear lay scattered as though the women would need them in another life. It was as though their household had been packed and placed aboard the ship, ready for a journey beyond death. One detail, however, unsettled scholars. The burial also contained evidence of sacrifice. The animals, at least 14 horses, 4 dogs, and 2 oxen, had been killed deliberately to accompany the women. The horses, in particular, suggest wealth and prestige. They were not simply beasts of burden, but symbols of power. To lay them in the grave was to send the women forth, not as frail bodies, but as figures of dignity, surrounded by the trappings of status, standing at the site today. The Oseberg ship is preserved in Oslo's Viking Ship Museum, its wood restored, its carvings visible, its silent story on display. But to truly imagine the burial, you must return to the 9th century. Picture the funeral mound before it was sealed. A ship hauled from the water, dragged by ropes across land, placed into a pit dug into the soil. The two women, dressed in fine clothes, laid upon beds. Around them, treasures, tools, animals, priests chanting, families watching, the smell of sacrifice heavy in the air. Then the ship, covered with earth, disappearing from sight, waiting for 1,000 years until farmers, spades, uncovered it again. The Oseberg burial forces us to ask, who were these women that deserved such honor? In a culture often remembered for its warriors and raids, here lies a story of women whose lives, though largely invisible in the written record, were so important that their death demanded one of the grandest burials in Viking history. And so, as you picture the ship lying beneath its mound, a question rises softly. Were these women queens who ruled, priestesses who guided, or companions who shared a journey? And what does it mean that their ship still sails, not on the sea, but through our memory of them? When archaeologists uncovered the Oseberg mound, they expected to find another warrior king, another tale of battles and swords. Instead, they found two women, and their presence shifted the way we understand Viking society. For centuries, popular imagination has painted the Vikings as male raiders with axes and longships, their women left behind at farms. Yet here, in a grave richer than almost any warrior's, we find evidence that women could hold extraordinary power and prestige. The identities of the two women remain uncertain, but the debate itself is revealing. The older woman, with her frail bones and advanced age, may have been a queen or high noblewoman. Some scholars connect her to Queen Sar, the grandmother of Harald Fairhair, Norway's first king. If true, the burial would not only be about honor, but also about dynastic memory, a way of grounding the authority of future kings in the prestige of their ancestors. Others argue she might have been a religious figure, perhaps a vulva, a priestess of seer magic. The grave goods include items that some interpret as ritual tools, such as staffs, woven tapestries with symbolic designs, and animal head posts that could have had ceremonial use. The younger woman complicates the picture. Was she a servant, sacrificed to accompany the elder? Was she a companion, perhaps even a relative? Or was she herself a figure of importance, sharing the burial as an equal? The fact that she was interred alongside the elder suggests more than servitude. Her bones bore signs of illness, perhaps cancer, which might explain her death at a younger age. Yet her placement in the ship implies she, too, was honored. The grave goods speak volumes. Let us look more closely. The wooden carts and sledges were not practical wagons, but ceremonial vehicles, decorated with intricate carvings of animals, serpents, cats, birds, each interwoven in the classic Norse style. These objects hint at public rituals, processions, perhaps even religious ceremonies. The women may have presided over such events. Their authority, not military, but spiritual and cultural. Textiles found in the grave are among the finest preserved from the Viking Age. Fragments of wool and silk, dyed in deep reds and blues, revealed the artistry of Norse weaving. Some patterns are geometric, others depict scenes, possibly mythological or symbolic. The presence of silk is particularly striking. Silk would have traveled along trade routes, reaching from Byzantium or even China. To find it in a burial mound in rural Norway shows the reach of Viking trade and the wealth of those buried. Here, the sacrifice of animals adds another layer. 14 horses, 4 dogs, and 2 oxen were killed and placed in the grave. Horses, especially, carried symbolic weight in Norse culture. They were connected to gods, to fertility, and to journeys between worlds. In this context, the horses may have been intended to draw the ship into the next life, as though the mound itself were a harbor, and the animals were its crew. The dogs, faithful companions, might symbolize loyalty. The oxen suggests provision, a supply of strength for the afterlife. One of the most remarkable artifacts was a set of carved animal head posts. Their function still debated. The heads, dragons, cats, and other beasts, are carved with wide eyes and snarling mouths, their necks curving with intricate patterns. Were they guardians placed to protect the women in death? Or were they ritual objects used in ceremonies before being buried? Their mystery only deepens the strangeness of the burial. The grave also contained simple domestic tools, buckets, cooking vessels, weaving implements. These may seem mundane, but they, too, are telling. In Viking belief, the afterlife required continuity of daily life. Just as pharaohs filled their tombs with food, beds, and furniture, so too did the Vikings. Death was not an end, but a continuation, and one needed tools for the journey. The presence of both grand and ordinary objects shows that these women were not only figures of power, but also anchors of household and community. The Oseberg burial challenges the assumption that Viking women lived only in the shadows of their men. Here, we see women given the highest funerary honors, buried not just with wealth, but with symbols of leadership and ritual authority. Some historians argue that the Oseberg women may have been priestesses of Freya or Odin, figures who wielded spiritual power that rivaled the political power of kings. Others insist they were aristocrats, dynastic figures whose burials reinforced the legitimacy of ruling families. Either way, the burial suggests that Viking society allowed certain women to achieve prominence, both in life and in memory. But there is another detail, unsettling and easily overlooked. Evidence suggests that the burial may not have been entirely peaceful. The younger woman's bones show signs of illness, but some scholars wonder if she was sacrificed to accompany the elder. Moreover, the careful arrangement of goods and animals hints at ritual, perhaps even human sacrifice, though no direct evidence survives. The presence of two women together, one old, one middle-aged, invites speculation about roles, hierarchies, and choices made at death. For the Vikings, ships were more than wood and sail. They were metaphors. A ship could carry you across seas in life, and across realms in death. To be buried in one was a privilege few could attain. Most Vikings were buried with far humbler graves, simple pits, small offerings, sometimes cremation. The Oseberg ship was a rare honor, a statement that these women mattered deeply to their people, whether as queens, priestesses, or symbols of continuity. Imagine the funeral itself. The ship hauled up from the water, dragged over logs across the field. The mound dug wide enough to contain it. People gathered from far and wide. Farmers, warriors, families, priests. The elder woman laid in her bed, the younger beside her. Around them, treasures carefully arranged, animals led forward and sacrificed. The air heavy with incense and blood. Then, slowly, soil covering the ship, layer upon layer, until the vessel vanished, sealed beneath earth. For those present, it was not just burial, but transformation. They believed the women were not lost, but journeying, sailing into another realm. And now, more than 1,000 years later, their ship rests in a museum, admired by millions. Their bones, studied by scientists, tell fragments of their story. Their grave goods reveal wealth, belief, and artistry, yet their names remain unknown, their voices silent. And so you are left with the lingering question: were these women queens whose rules shaped Norway, priestesses whose rituals bound their people, or simply symbols chosen to carry the weight of memory? And how much of their true story has been lost beneath the soil of time? The Oseberg Mound lay silent for more than a millennium. Generations passed, seasons shifted, farms rose and fell, and the grass-covered hill became just another shape in the Norwegian landscape. To the farmers who worked the land in the 19th century, it was little more than an obstacle, a mound of soil to be cut away. Yet inside, beneath damp earth and clay, one of the most important Viking discoveries waited patiently. In the summer of 1904, two farmers digging into the mound struck wood. At first, it seemed ordinary, perhaps remnants of a tree. But as more of the curved planks were revealed, scholars were alerted. Excavation began quickly, and within weeks, the outline of a ship emerged, a vessel buried deep, preserved by the heavy clay soil that kept it from rotting away. As the earth was cleared, the archaeologists realized they were not looking at fragments, but at one of the most complete Viking ships ever found. The excavation was painstaking. Each plank, each artifact, was carefully lifted, documented, and preserved. What emerged was astonishing. A nearly complete ship, rich with carvings, its prow curling like a serpent, its sides decorated with interlacing animals. Inside were two skeletons, alongside grave goods of a richness that few Viking sites could rival. The Oseberg discovery electrified the archaeological world. For the first time, the grandeur of Viking burials was revealed in full. Yet the find also stirred debate. Who were these women, and why had they been buried with such honor? Early scholars leaned toward identifying the elder as Queen Ser, grandmother of Harald Fairhair. This theory gave the burial dynastic weight, the ancestors of Norway's first king honored in death as much as in life. Others disagreed, suggesting priestesses or cult leaders instead. The carved animal head posts, the tapestries with symbolic designs, and the ceremonial carts pointed toward ritual rather than political power. The debate deepened when the women's bones were studied. The elder's skeleton showed signs of age, worn teeth, frail bones, curvature of the spine. The younger woman's remains revealed illness, possibly cancer. Neither showed obvious signs of violence, though some speculated the younger might have been sacrificed to accompany the elder. Over time, forensic studies cast doubt on the Queen Sar theory, suggesting instead that these women may have held religious roles, leaders in ritual, if not in rule. The grave goods themselves continued to yield secrets. The wooden carts and sledges, decorated with fantastical animals, were unlike ordinary wagons. Their function seemed ceremonial, perhaps for processions. The tapestries, though fragmented, depict strange scenes, figures, animals, possibly mythological motifs. Some scholars see in them hints of Norse cosmology, rituals of fertility, or ceremonies of death. The objects seemed less about daily life and more about performance, spectacle, and meaning. The Oseberg ship became a window into the richness of Viking art. The carvings on wood, the woven patterns, the ornate fittings all reveal a culture deeply invested in beauty as well as function. This was not merely a society of raiders and farmers, but of craftsmen, weavers, and storytellers who etched their beliefs into every object. Yet even the ship itself carried mystery. Built in the early 800s, it was seaworthy. But the way it was buried suggests it was reserved for ritual rather than raiding. Its wide hull and shallow draft made it less ideal for long voyages and more suited to short ceremonial use. Some have suggested it may have been used in life for religious festivals, paraded across land, carrying priestesses or leaders in grand displays. If true, its burial marked not only the death of two women, but the retirement of a sacred vessel. After excavation, the ship was reconstructed and displayed in Oslo, where it still stands today in the Viking Ship Museum. Visitors walk along its sides, marveling at the serpent-carved prow, the smooth lines of the hull, the silent presence of a vessel meant not for water but for eternity. The artifacts are displayed nearby, fragile fragments of wood and cloth that once filled the ship's interior. Together, they give a rare glimpse into a burial world that otherwise would have vanished. But time has not been kind. The preservation methods of the early 20th century were primitive compared to today's standards. Chemicals applied to the wood caused damage over decades, weakening the planks. Today, conservators struggle to preserve what remains, knowing that without careful care, even this great ship could eventually crumble. The Oseberg ship is both a treasure and a challenge, a reminder that the past survives only as long as we tend to it. The Oseberg burial also reshaped how historians think about Viking women. It revealed that women could occupy positions of immense importance, honored in ways once assumed reserved for men, whether queens, priestesses, or something in between. The women of Oseberg commanded respect, enough to warrant a burial richer than most kings. Their legacy challenges the narrow view of Viking culture as purely reminding us that power in the past often wore many faces. And so you picture the ship once more, lying beneath its mound in the 9th century, soil piled high above it, grass growing quietly, centuries of snow and rain pressing it down. Farmers plough their fields overhead, unaware of the sleeping vessel below. The two women rest side by side, their treasures surrounding them, their animals sacrificed for their journey. And the ship, though buried, still sails, not across seas, but across time, carrying their memory into the modern world. You are left with a final question. Lingering like the scent of damp earth, did the Oseberg women know, as they were laid in their ship, that their burial would one day be remembered as one of the greatest treasures of the Viking Age? Or did they believe, as their people surely did, that their voyage was not to memory, but to another world entirely? Story 4. The king who vanished into salt the earth beneath Poland hides more than coal and minerals. In its depths lie veins of salt, carved into glittering caverns that echo with human footsteps and whispered prayers. Salt was once called white gold, shaping economies and sustaining kingdoms. And in the ancient crypts of Poland, salt did more than flavor food or preserve meat. It preserved kings, nobles, and bishops, transforming them into strange relics of time. Our story begins in the city of Krakow, the historic heart of Poland, where the wall cathedral rises above the Vistula River. For centuries, this cathedral was the resting place of Polish kings, yet many burials did not endure as intended. Bodies decayed, tombs crumbled, and memory faded. In contrast, deep in the salt mines of Wieleczka and Bochnia, burials took on a different character. Here, salt itself became the shroud, preserving the dead in ways that stone and marble could not. The Wieleczka salt mine, a vast labyrinth stretching for miles beneath the earth, dates back to the 13th century. Generations of miners carved its tunnels, chapels, and chambers from pure salt. By candlelight, they sculpted altars, staircases, even chandeliers that glimmered with crystalline salt. Over time, the mine became not only a workplace, but a sacred space. And in its depths, it also became a crypt. Some burials here were accidental, miners who perished in cave-ins, their bodies swallowed by salt and preserved like relics. Others were deliberate, nobles and clergy entombed in salt chambers, their corpses desiccated and hardened until they seemed carved from stone. Salt, the substance that sustained kingdoms, also became their burial cloth. The most striking stories, however, concerned Poland's kings. While many monarchs rested in Wall's grand cathedral, tales circulated of bodies hidden in salt mines, swallowed by the earth, their remains transformed into statues of salt. One such tale clings to King Kazimierz, the great Kazimierz III, 1310 to 1370. He was one of Poland's most important rulers, remembered for building cities, codifying laws, and leaving the kingdom stronger than he found it. When he died, legend says, part of his legacy was tied to salt. Kazimierz had expanded mining rights, using salt wealth to fund his realm. In popular imagination, it seemed only fitting that his body might have been absorbed by the very substance that enriched his people. Though historical records insist Kazimierz was buried in Wałbrzych, folk stories whisper of his body hidden deep in Wieliczka, preserved in crystalline layers. Some miners swore they saw a kingly figure in the salt walls, a silhouette of a man crowned in white. Was it simply a mineral formation, or a vision of a king who had vanished into salt? The tale grew, passed in murmurs from one generation of miners to another. There is a strange poetry in the idea. Unlike marble tombs that crumble, salt changes slowly, crystallizing over time. Bodies buried in its depths do not rot as quickly. Instead, they shrink, harden, and remain like artifacts of flesh and stone fused together. For medieval Poles, salt was wealth, life, and preservation. To imagine a king resting in salt was to imagine him eternal, part of the very earth that sustained his people. The cathedral crypts of Wall also tell their own unsettling tales. Archaeologists who examined royal tombs in the 20th century found unexpected traces of salt within the coffins, perhaps sprinkled as a preservative, perhaps symbolic of purity. The line between legend and practice blurs. Did Poland's kings truly vanish into salt, or did salt simply cling to their memory because it was the essence of their wealth? The Wieliczka mine today is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, visited by tourists who descend hundreds of meters into its cool depths. They walk through chapels carved of salt, past altars where miners once prayed, past sculptures of saints and kings glittering in crystalline walls. Guides tell stories of miners who died here, their bodies found decades later intact, preserved as though asleep. Among these tales, the whispers of vanished kings linger, half history, half myth. To walk here in imagination is to feel the weight of centuries pressing down. The tunnels stretch endlessly, lit by flickering lamps. The walls shimmer faintly, as though lined with frost, though it is salt, not ice. The air is heavy, dry, and still. Somewhere in the silence, you imagine hearing the echo of picks against stone, the prayers of miners, the hushed stories told at night of kings who rest in salt. The image stays with you, a king vanishing not into fire, nor into marble, but into a mineral that both feeds and preserves. Salt, the humblest of substances, becomes both tomb and monument, and you are left with the question, Were these kings truly buried in salt? Or was salt itself, the way Poland remembered them, as part of the land, inseparable from the people they ruled? Step again into the mouth of the Wieliczka salt mine, and let your imagination descend with the miners of centuries past. Wooden stairs creak, lanterns flicker, and the air grows cooler as you move deeper underground. The stone gives way to salt, not dull but shimmering, crystalline walls carved into archways, chapels, and chambers. For those who worked here, salt was life. For those who were buried here, salt was eternity. Salt in medieval Poland was more than a mineral. It was wealth, authority, and survival. Cold, white gold, it fueled economies long before silver or coal. Kings drew enormous revenue from the salt mines of Wieliczka and Bochnia, which were among Europe's most productive. Taxes on salt, called the Gupi Krakowski, filled royal coffers, funded armies, built cities. Every grain of salt was both seasoning for food and coin for the treasury. The miners who descended daily into the earth lived dangerous lives. Tunnels could collapse, floods could swallow passages, gas could suffocate. Yet salt was also strangely kind. Unlike damp stone, it desiccated flesh, preserving it. Stories grew of miners killed in accidents, whose bodies remained remarkably intact. Their skin hardened, their features recognizable years later. For their comrades, these bodies seemed more than corpses. They were signs that salt held a protective, almost sacred quality, and so, when nobles or clergy were buried in salt chambers, the practice carried meaning. To rest in salt was to rest in purity, preserved not by artifice, but by nature. Bodies buried in wood coffins decayed quickly, but bodies left in salt shrank and hardened, becoming statues of themselves. In a land where salt was life, it became death's ally too. The great salt chambers became more than mines. They became sanctuaries. Miners carved chapels underground, complete with altars, pulpits, and statues of saints, all from salt. The most famous, the Chapel of St. Kinga, glitters like a subterranean cathedral, its chandeliers carved from salt crystals, its walls etched with biblical scenes. Here, miners prayed before shifts, seeking protection from the dangers of the earth. Here too, perhaps, burials gained a sacred tone. As the salt became both earth and church, legends of kings preserved in salt took root in this atmosphere. The most enduring involved Kazimierz the Great. He had expanded Poland's mining operations, ensuring that salt revenues made the kingdom wealthy. For miners, Kazimierz was tied not only to laws and castles, but to their very livelihood. Over time, his death became entwined with salt folklore. Miners whispered that his body had not decayed, but crystallized, merging with the substance he had cherished. In moments of solitude, some swore they saw his silhouette in salt walls, a crowned figure watching over them. But Kazimierz was not the only monarch linked with salt. Other kings, buried in Wall Cathedral, were said to have been preserved with salt sprinkled into their coffins. Archaeological investigations of war tombs in the 20th century found traces of salt and natron, a reminder that even in Krakow's Grand Cathedral, salt accompanied kings to their rest. Was it for preservation, or for symbolism, purity, incorruptibility, eternal life? Perhaps both. The miners themselves became guardians of these stories. For them, salt was not abstract wealth, but daily labor. They hauled blocks, carved tunnels, risked their lives. When kings taxed salt, miners felt the burden. When kings used salt wealth to build armies, miners saw their sweat transformed into swords and banners. To imagine kings returning to salt in death was to imagine a circle completed, rulers born of earth, enriched by salt, and preserved by it. Daily life in the mines was full of hardship, but also ritual. Lanterns burned dimly, casting shadows across salt walls that glittered like frost. The sound of picks echoed endlessly. Men carved not only tunnels, but art, small figures, crude crosses, prayers etched into the salt. In breaks, they prayed in underground chapels, lit candles before statues of Saint Barbara, patron saint of miners. The mine was a workplace, a church, and, at times, a tomb. The preservation of bodies in salt carried an eerie familiarity. Unlike fire or decay, salt kept features intact. Miners who found preserved comrades felt as though the dead still labored alongside them. Salt blurred the line between life and death, between memory and presence. The crypts of nobles and clergy within salt chambers amplified this feeling. The powerful did not vanish, but became part of the mine itself. Legends tell of entire burial chambers lost in collapses, sealed in salt forever. Perhaps they are still there, hidden in unexcavated passages, kings and priests waiting as statues of crystal. Whether true or not, the idea reflects the deep reverence miners had for salt as both destroyer and preserver. That the Alechka mine today is visited by millions. Its chapels admired, its tunnels walked by tourists. But for centuries, it was a place of sweat, death, and whispers. Stories of kings who vanished into salt were not written in chronicles, but told in lamplight. Carried by miners who knew better than anyone the strange alchemy of salt. As you walk through this imagined mine, the silence grows heavy. Walls glimmer faintly. Statues of saints carved from salt gaze with unblinking eyes, and the air tastes faintly of minerals. Somewhere, perhaps behind a wall yet unbroken, lies a body preserved, skin turned to leather, bones hardened into stone. Was it a miner? A priest? A king? You cannot know. And so, as you linger in this subterranean world, one question follows you upward, toward the light. Were Poland's kings truly taken by salt? Their bodies preserved in crystalline embrace? Or have we simply salted their memory with legend, until myth itself hardened into history? Contrary to older myths, these were not slaves driven by whips. Archaeological evidence from workers' villages at Giza shows that pyramid builders were fed with bread, beer, and meat, housed in organized communities. They were laborers fulfilling a duty to king and country, their work both obligation and honor. For them, Snefru's pyramids were not abstract monuments, but lived reality, the rhythm of stone and sweat that filled their days. Snefru's reign thus embodies a paradox. A king remembered not for conquests or wars, but for construction. His greatest legacy was not an empire of land, but an empire of stone. He transformed the pyramid from uncertain experiment into eternal symbol. Later, kings Khufu, Khafre, Menkaure inherited his template. The Great Pyramid of Giza, one of the 7 wonders of the world, is unimaginable without Snefru's trial and error, and yet, the bent pyramid lingers as a reminder that eternity is rarely achieved without mistakes. Its odd profile makes it one of the most distinctive monuments in Egypt. Unlike the collapsed ruin of Medum, it still stands complete. Its casing stones intact at the base, shining white against desert sand. To stand before it is to sense both grandeur and humility, a king's ambition bending under the weight of stone, yet refusing to fall. For the Egyptians, these monuments were more than tombs. They were expressions of Mat, cosmic order, balance, stability. To build a pyramid was to anchor the universe, to ensure the Nile flowed, the sun rose, and Egypt endured. Sneferu's repeated attempts reveal not vanity but devotion to this cosmic duty. Each failure was not the end, but a step toward perfection. Each adjustment a reaffirmation of order against chaos. Consider also the spiritual symbolism of the pyramid shape itself. Its sloping sides echoed the rays of the sun, guiding the king's soul upward to join Ra, the sun god. Its base represented the solid earth, its apex the heavens. In Sneferu's reign, this form crystallized. The bent pyramid, with its shifting angles, seems almost transitional, bridging old forms and new. The red pyramid, by contrast, embodies the perfected vision, a smooth ascent from earth to sky. The human cost of these projects was immense, but so too was their meaning. For the workers, each block laid was part of something greater than themselves. For Sneferu, each monument was a step toward eternity. For history, each pyramid became a lesson in persistence. And so you picture Sneferu at Dosha, watching as his bent pyramid rises, then ordering another beside it. Perhaps he saw the flaw, the bend, and demanded perfection. Perhaps he saw meaning in the mistake, a dual form for a dual world. We cannot know, but we know this. His vision reshaped Egypt forever, and here, standing before the red pyramid in your imagination, its reddish limestone glowing under the desert sun, a question forms quietly in the silence. Was Sneferu's true legacy the pyramid in which he was buried? Or was it the bent, broken, and collapsed monuments along the way, the mistakes without which eternity itself could not have been built? The desert of Dosha stretches wide and still. 3 monuments rise there, the broken ruin at Medum, the adangled bent pyramid, and the glowing red pyramid. Together, they tell the story of one king's obsession, Pharaoh Sneferu, the builder who gave Egypt the blueprint for eternity. But what remains of him now, thousands of years later? Not his body, not his treasures, only stone, silence, and memory. Sneferu's legacy is not as celebrated as that of his son, Khufu, who built the Great Pyramid at Giza. Yet, in many ways, Sneferu's reign is more instructive. He was not remembered for conquest or wealth, but for persistence. He built, failed, adapted, and built again. He left behind not 1 pyramid, but 3, each a lesson carved into desert rock. The Medum pyramid shows ambition colliding with instability. Its collapse revealed the risks of innovation, a reminder that eternity is never guaranteed. For later Egyptians, it may have stood as a cautionary ruin, a reminder of the limits of stone and gravity. Yet it also preserved the memory of daring, the willingness to reshape tradition into something new. The bent pyramid stands unique, its double slope visible for miles. To some, it was a mistake corrected mid-build. To others, it was deliberate, a dual symbol of earth and sky, of human and divine. Its survival, intact and well preserved, suggests that failure may itself be endurance. Unlike Medum, it did not collapse. Unlike Giza, it was not crowded with tourists or treasure hunters. Instead, it remains quiet, almost forgotten. Its white casing stones gleaming at its base, like snow in the desert. The red pyramid, by contrast, is triumph. A perfect form, stable and enduring, it set the pattern for every pyramid that followed. It may well have been Sneferu's final resting place, though his mummy is long gone. To walk inside its chambers today, the corbelled ceilings towering above, is to feel both awe and emptiness. The man who ordered it built has vanished, but the structure remains silent and steady, as though mocking mortality itself. Sneferu's reign also reshaped Egypt politically and spiritually. His building projects required not only labor but organization. Villagers were mobilized, resources directed, logistics mastered. The system that supported pyramid building became a system that supported empire. Sneferu's pyramids were not just tombs, they were exercises in statecraft, proving Egypt's ability to marshal its people toward a single vision. Later, Egyptians remembered Sneferu with reverence. Records from the Middle Kingdom describe him as a beloved king, kind to his people, generous in spirit. Tales from papyri centuries later portray him sailing on lakes with maidens, a symbol of joy and harmony. His pyramids stood as proof of a reign that balanced ambition with order. 2 Egyptians. Sneferu embodied Mat, the cosmic balance between chaos and stability, yet modern eyes see something more human. In Sneferu's pyramids, we see not only majesty but error, not only triumph but adjustment. His monuments remind us that greatness is often built on imperfection. Without Medum's collapse, there would be no bent pyramid. Without the bent pyramid's awkward angles, there would be no red pyramid. Without Sneferu's experiments, there would be no Giza. Eternity itself was built on trial and failure. This legacy is strangely comforting. Pharaohs are often remembered as remote, divine figures, distant from human struggle. Sneferu, however, appears closer. His monuments are flawed, his ambitions corrected, his eternity forged through persistence rather than perfection. In his pyramids, we glimpse the humanity of kingship, the willingness to try, to fail, to try again. The desert holds these lessons in silence. Walk around Dosha today, and you find the pyramids standing apart from the crowded sites of Giza. Few tourists come here. The sand drifts quietly at their bases. The air is still. The bent pyramid looms, its strange profile cutting the horizon. The red pyramid glows in the sunlight, its form simple and pure. And the ruins of Medum crumble, a monument to ambition undone. Together, they whisper of a king who sought eternity and, in his own way, found it. But eternity is never simple. Sneferu's body is gone, his treasures stolen, his name overshadowed by his son's greater monument. Yet his pyramids endure, 3 variations on a theme, 3 lessons carved in stone. They are not just tombs. They are experiments in immortality. And so, as you picture yourself walking away from Dosha, the wind at your back, the pyramids fading into the haze, you are left with a quiet question. Is eternity achieved through perfection, or through persistence, through monuments that bend, collapse, and rise again, each imperfection shaping the path to forever? Story 5. The pharaoh who built a pyramid for eternity. The desert wind moves endlessly across the plateau of Dosha, brushing sand against stone. To the south of Cairo, 2 strange pyramids rise, their angles cutting sharp against the horizon. One leans too steeply, then suddenly shifts into a shallower slope halfway up, giving it a bent, awkward appearance. It is known today as the Bent Pyramid, and it tells the story of one of Egypt's most ambitious kings, Pharaohs, the first ruler of the 4th dynasty, and the man who transformed the pyramid into the shape we most recognize today. Sneferu reigned around 2600 BC, long before Khufu built the Great Pyramid at Giza. Yet without Sneferu, Khufu's monument would never have existed. Sneferu was an innovator, a king obsessed with architecture, who ordered at least 3 great pyramids built during his reign. He experimented with design, pushing the limits of engineering, determined to create an eternal house that would secure his afterlife and project his power forever. The bent pyramid at Dosha is the most famous of these experiments. Rising to 344 feet, it begins at a steep 54-degree angle, but halfway up changes suddenly to 43 degrees, giving it a broken, bent silhouette. To stand before it today is to sense both grandeur and imperfection, a monument that aspires to eternity but reveals the trial and error behind immortality. Why the bend? Scholars debate. Some believe the steep angle at the base proved unstable, threatening collapse as the structure rose. Builders may have reduced the angle mid-construction to save it. Others suggest it was intentional, a symbolic shape reflecting duality, perhaps two pyramids in one, perhaps heaven meeting earth. Whatever the reason, the result is striking. A pyramid unlike any other, its form both elegant and flawed, a frozen moment of ancient trial inside. The bent pyramid is equally fascinating. It contains 2 burial chambers, connected by passages at different heights, each with corbelled ceilings to distribute weight. The precision of the stonework is astonishing. Narrow shafts lead inward, the air cool and musty even now. Archaeologists once believed Sneferu intended to rest here, though no body has been found. The tomb, like so many in Egypt, was likely plundered in antiquity, leaving only empty chambers and the mystery of intention. But the bent pyramid was only part of Sneferu's legacy. At Medum, further south, he had earlier attempted another great pyramid, one that began as a step pyramid and was later filled in to create smooth sides. Known as the Medum Pyramid, it collapsed in antiquity, leaving a ruin of stone blocks that tumble outward like a broken mountain. Yet this failure taught lessons in stability and design that shaped later monuments. And after the bent pyramid, Sneferu built yet another, the Red Pyramid, also at Dosha. This one rose at a consistent angle, its reddish limestone glowing in the desert sun. Standing at 341 feet, it was the first successful true pyramid in history, precursor to Khufu's Great Pyramid. Many believe Sneferu was finally buried here in the Red Pyramid, though again his body has not been found. The story of Sneferu is thus a story of persistence. He did not build one pyramid, but 3, learning from failure, adapting design, and shaping eternity one stone at a time. His architects experimented with angles, with corbelled chambers, with smooth casing stones. Through trial and error, they created the formula that would define Egyptian kingship for centuries. Imagine, for a moment, the labor behind these structures. Tens of thousands of workers, not slaves, as old myths once suggested, but laborers drawn from across the land, supported by food rations and housing. They quarried limestone, dragged blocks on sledges, raised ramps of mud brick and rubble. The sound of hammers on stone echoed day and night. The desert floor was scarred with ramps, sledges, and campfires. Building Sneferu's pyramids was not only architecture but an act of national unity, pulling resources and people together under the will of the king. Sneferu himself is remembered not only as a builder but as a ruler who embodied the idea of mat order, balance, harmony. His pyramids reflected this belief. Eternal houses meant to stabilize the universe, to ensure Egypt endured as long as stone itself. And yet, The bent pyramid reveals the tension between ambition and reality. Even divine kings faced gravity, engineering limits, and the possibility of failure. To walk around the bent pyramid today is to feel its strangeness. Its polished casing stones still cling to the base, making it one of the best preserved pyramids in Egypt. The angle change is abrupt, almost human in its mistake, a reminder that eternity is shaped by trial. The silence around it is heavy, broken only by desert wind. Few tourists wander here compared to Giza. It is a quieter, lonelier monument, its grandeur softened by imperfection. And so you stand before Sneferu's bent monument, and you wonder, was this pyramid a failure, an accident corrected in haste? Or was it the deliberate expression of a king who sought eternity in forms we still struggle to understand? To understand Sneferu's pyramids, you must imagine Egypt not as it is now, but as it was in his time, fertile fields stretching along the Nile, villages humming with life, and the desert fringes buzzing with the labor of thousands. The pyramid age was young then, still an experiment, still uncertain. Sneferu's reign transformed it into a tradition. His first great attempt was at Medem, some 60 miles south of modern Cairo. The pyramid there began under his predecessor, Huni, as a step pyramid, a series of stacked terraces rising toward the sky. Sneferu sought to transform it, filling in the steps to create smooth sides, an innovation that would redefine Egyptian kingship. But the design was flawed. The outer casing collapsed, likely during or soon after Sneferu's reign. Today, the Medem pyramid looks like a stone tower rising from a heap of rubble. Its sides broken, its base littered with massive fallen blocks. For archaeologists, it is both ruin and revelation. Its collapse shows the risks of ambition, but also the determination of Sneferu to refine the form. From Medem, Sneferu moved to Dosha, where he ordered the construction of another great pyramid, the one we now call the Bent Pyramid. Its unusual shape, changing angles halfway up, reveals both daring and adaptation. Some scholars argue the builders realized the steep angle was too dangerous as cracks appeared in the stone, forcing them to adjust. Others see symbolism, perhaps a dual pyramid representing heaven and earth, or an architectural compromise meant to prevent collapse. Whatever the cause, the Bent Pyramid became unique, a monument both bold and imperfect, standing as if frozen in mid-correction. Yet Sneferu was not satisfied. Near the Bent Pyramid, he ordered a third monument, the Red Pyramid, named for the reddish hue of its limestone core. Here, his builders finally perfected the design. Rising at a shallower angle of 43 degrees, it was stable, elegant, and complete. At 341 feet, it became the world's first successful true pyramid, smooth-sided from base to summit. Its internal chambers, with corbelled ceilings rising high, reveal the mastery of weight and stone that would soon culminate in Khufu's Great. Pyramid Dot, the Red Pyramid, may have been Sneferu's final resting place. Its burial chamber, deep within, once held a sarcophagus, though, like so many tombs, it was robbed in antiquity. No mummy remains, no treasures, only silence and stone. Yet in this silence, Sneferu's achievement endures. He had turned experiment into formula, trial into tradition. What is striking is not just the monuments themselves, but the scale of Sneferu's ambition. To build 3 massive pyramids in one reign required staggering resources. Modern estimates suggest tens of thousands of workers labored seasonally, drawn from farming villages across Egypt. They quarried stone from nearby cliffs, floated blocks down the Nile, hauled them on sledges, lubricated with water across ramps of mud and rubble. Each pyramid was not just a tomb, but a national project, uniting people in the service of eternity. Story 1. The pharaoh buried with his servants. So imagine yourself standing on the banks of the Nile around 3000 BCE. The river glides slowly, its surface reflecting the desert sun in muted ripples, as though time itself moves more sluggishly here. The air is heavy with the smell of silt, reeds, and the faint smoke of funeral fires rising in the distance. You hear the low sound of chants, words in a language you do not know but can almost feel vibrating through the air. The chants are for a king, a pharaoh named Jer, one of Egypt's earliest rulers, whose death marked not only the end of a life but the beginning of something far stranger in the annals of burial traditions. Jer was not as famous as the later pharaohs, not like Khufu, who built the Great Pyramid, or Tut, whose tomb dazzled modern archaeologists. Yet, in the quiet sands of Abydos, where Jer was buried, something unfolded that still disturbs historians today. When he died, perhaps around 3050 BCE, dozens, maybe even hundreds, of people were buried with him. Not statues, not symbolic figures, but real human beings. Servants, courtiers, attendants. Some were young men and women, others perhaps older. They were placed in graves surrounding his tomb, as though his afterlife demanded not only his possessions, but also the lives of those who had served him in this one. Pause a moment to consider this. You walk among these ancient graves, and you realize that each shallow pit once held a person who had a family, a name, a story. Yet their lives ended because the pharaohs did. To us, it seems brutal, but to them, perhaps it was seen as honor, perhaps it was obligation, or perhaps they had no choice at all. Archaeologists uncovered these satellite burials in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The tomb of Jer itself was identified in Abydos, in what the Egyptians called the El-Kub, the mother of pots. The name came from the shards of thousands of broken pottery, vessels scattered in the desert, remnants of offerings left for the dead. And there, among the broken clay, lay the silent witnesses to this strange custom. The layout of Jer's tomb is simple, rectangular, with chambers for his body and goods. Around it, in carefully arranged rows, lie the smaller graves. Some contain young women with jewelry still on their bones. Others hold men with simple tools or weapons, as though, even in death, they were expected to serve as guards. Unlike later Egyptian burials, which relied on carved figurines called ushabetis to symbolically serve the king, these were real sacrifices. You may wonder, how did they die? Were they killed outright, strangled, poisoned, or did they go willingly into the earth? Evidence suggests that many of them were strangled or suffocated, perhaps in a ritual that promised them a place beside the pharaoh in eternity. Their graves show no signs of violent struggle, leading some to think the act was systematic, controlled, and ritualized. Imagine the quiet as each servant lay down, or was laid down, and the sand covered them. The practice wasn't unique to Jer, though his burial is among the most striking examples. Early dynastic pharaohs often surrounded themselves with sacrificed retainers. It was only later, as Egyptian culture evolved, that the practice faded. Instead, kings turned to symbolic substitutes, small figures carved from stone or wood that could stand, in for real people in the afterlife. But in Jer's time, the boundary between life and death was crossed literally. There's something unsettling in this practice. And yet, as you listen to the story in this quiet moment, it also reveals how differently these ancient people understood duty, loyalty, and eternity. For them, the pharaoh was not just a man, but a god on earth. To be buried with him was to step into eternity itself. That eternity, however, was forced, demanded, an absolute dot. Think, too, of the daily life of these attendants before the king's death. Did they serve him in the palace? Did they fetch water, prepare food, polish gold vessels, carry messages? Did they sense, even as they served him, that when his time came, so too would theirs? That their fates were not their own, but tied by invisible chains to the life of the god-king they served? The archaeological details are precise but haunting. Excavators found more than 300 subsidiary burials linked to early dynastic kings at Abydos. Some belonged to Jer's reign. Rows upon rows of graves, neatly dug, lined with mud brick, filled at once. It suggests that the deaths were not spread over years, but happened in a single moment, a mass ritual to accompany the king into the next world. This practice, known as retainer sacrifice, disappeared by the end of Egypt's first dynasty. But in Jer's time, it marked a belief system where the power of the king extended beyond life. The king's death was not an end, but a continuation, and for his attendants, their role in life was carried into death. And so you walk away from this tomb in your imagination, the desert wind brushing the sand across your skin, and you are left with an uneasy question. Were these servants honored to follow their king into eternity? Or were they victims of a system that left them no choice at all? Close your eyes again and let yourself drift back into the desert. The air is dry, the sand shifting quietly underfoot. And before you stretches a vast cemetery, the royal necropolis of Abydos. This is where Egypt's earliest rulers were laid to rest. If you stood there today, you would see low mud brick ruins half swallowed by the desert. But if you stood there thousands of years ago, the scene would have been crowded with mourners, priests, and laborers digging graves for more than just the king. Pharaoh Jer's tomb was only one among many. His predecessors and successors followed similar customs, creating what archaeologists later recognized as a unique and troubling pattern of burial. Retainer sacrifice was not a one-time occurrence. Instead, it seems to have been a practice woven into the very fabric of early dynastic kingship. Archaeologists uncovered rows of subsidiary graves around the tombs of Jer, Den, and other early kings of the first dynasty. In Jer's burial, estimates suggest that more than 300 attendants may have been interred. His successor, Pharaoh Den, also had nearly 200. Even Queen Mernith, a rare female ruler, had retainers sacrificed at her burial. It paints a grim picture of a society in which the lives of many were spent for the afterlife of one. Yet the story is more than numbers. Each of those subsidiary graves represents a person. Some were women wearing bead necklaces. Others were men buried with weapons, as though still guarding the king in the afterlife. The layout suggests careful planning. They were not simply thrown into a mass grave, but placed deliberately in rows, as though still organized in service. This quiet detail is what makes it more haunting. Even in death, hierarchy persisted. The question that lingers is why. Why did Egyptians of this period feel it necessary to send real human lives with the king into eternity? Later, Egyptians, as you know, turned to symbolic figures, creating little worker statuettes called ushabtis. By the Middle and New Kingdoms, pharaohs might be buried with hundreds of these figurines. Each ushabti was carved to hold tools, with inscriptions commanding them to do labor in the afterlife on behalf of the king. But in Jair's time, the Egyptians had not yet developed this symbolic system. Instead, they turned to the literal. One explanation is that they believed the afterlife was a continuation of this one, and that the king would require the same services. He needed guards, cooks, companions, and musicians. If he was divine, it followed naturally that his court would accompany him beyond death. Another explanation is less spiritual and more political. Mass burials reinforced the idea of the pharaoh's power. To sacrifice so many lives at his passing showed the people that the king's authority extended even beyond the grave. There is also the possibility of ritualized belief. Death in ancient Egypt was not an ending, but a transformation. For the attendants who followed their king, perhaps priests convinced them that dying with him meant securing a place beside him in eternity, an honor otherwise unattainable. We cannot know their private thoughts. Were they resigned? Were they terrified? Did families grieve in silence, or did they console themselves that their loved ones were chosen for a sacred task? When archaeologists studied the graves, they found something striking. The burials all appeared to have happened at once. The attendants' tombs were filled simultaneously, not gradually. That suggests a carefully orchestrated event. The moment the pharaoh died, preparations began not only for his tomb, but for theirs as well. Imagine the scene. Priests chanting, the smell of incense, workers carrying baskets of sand, families gathered in hushed silence, and one by one, attendants laying down to join their king forever. But then, something changed. By the end of Egypt's first dynasty, retainer sacrifice disappeared. Later, pharaohs did not bury real attendants, but instead filled their tombs with figurines, images, or painted walls depicting servants. Why the shift? Historians suggest several reasons. One is practicality. Sacrificing hundreds of attendants with each burial could weaken the royal court. A new king needed experienced administrators, warriors, and servants to rule effectively. Killing them all at the old king's funeral may have been unsustainable. Another reason may have been evolving religious thought. Egyptians developed the idea that symbols, statues, carvings, even words could hold magical power. If an image of a servant could work in the afterlife, there was no need for a real person to die.